Hello, I'm Greg Farrar. It is May 2nd. This is my almost daily COVID-19 trends podcast live stream. I'm a little disorganized here at the beginning because, well, there are a lot of things going on. I'm trying to make sure that I can get back to my comments so that if people do comment on the video, I'll be able to see it. Okay, now I'm in the video. So I've been having technical challenges over the past couple days. I've reinstalled my computer operating system 3 times. It just doesn't seem to want to boot, but I think I finally got it working, kind of hacked it into working. And so hopefully at this point you can hear me. I can broadcast. Why is this not letting me see my own video? Okay, there it is. And it says someone's watching. Good. So if you're watching, if you can hear me, drop me a note in the chat if you can. I'm just going to dive in. So I will cover the countries of the world. I will cover the states of the United States, and I will cover the counties of California in 3 sections. And the purpose here really is to get a sense of what the short-term trends are. I'm not trying to make predictions about the long-term. The data isn't really, I don't think any data is able to do that. Lots of people trying, failing. I'm not really even trying. Those few times I've made little predictions, there are things like, I think the United States has peaked, or whatever, which it has now. But it didn't at the exact day that I said it would. So even then, even short term, the trends aren't super reliable. We see a particular country or region going upwards, and then suddenly it's going downwards on a fairly small granularity of a few days. And I am looking at a fairly small granularity so we can spot trends early, but it does also mean that we see a little bit more waveriness in some of these lines. But not these lines, well, not much. These are the total cases. United States this is a very boring story here. United States is beating everyone, everyone's heading upwards, everyone's roughly peaking, but there's no way we can see that from this graph. So let's move to the next one where we can, the number of daily cases, where we really can see that there's a peak. Actually, the way you can see it in this graph is by seeing that this is a straight line or slightly bent downward. But to my eye, it is not visibly bent downward. But if you look at this, you see it is really just a little bit, because a flat number of cases each day in the United States will gradually will make for a straight line, and a reducing number of cases each day will gradually make for hi Dari, I see you in chat. Will gradually make for a downward bend of that line. So we really know we've arrived when these lines flatten out. We're done when they flatten out. When these lines flatten out, the daily new cases, we're at least not growing exponentially anymore. We don't have an epidemic, epidemic growth anyway. We have a recovery. And the recovery in the United States here is slight. It's a pretty small downslope versus how it started, how it went into the peak. But it is a slight obvious downward slope in this graph. I'm going to look at it per capita because per capita lets us compare countries reasonably. I was afraid that would be Singapore. Yeah, so I haven't been into this data for a couple days because of my technical challenges, or at least I haven't talked with you all about it. But Singapore showed up on our radar a couple weeks ago as a possible future hotspot. Not really my radar, but the broad news started saying, oh no, Singapore. And shortly after that, then these trends started to show as well. What we see here is that most of the countries here show this hill shape. They went up, they flattened out in cases, and now they're dropping. And you see with cases like Spain, where they flattened at 130 roughly cases per million, and now are down to 23 cases per million. Some of these are really strong recoveries. They are a fifth or less of what they once were in new cases. So Spain is looking very good on this graph. Now, it's always possible that Spain is starting to lose its angle and trend back upwards, and that's what our next graph, the rope chart, will say. But overall, the trend for Spain is certainly exactly what we'd like to see. It peaked and now it's dropping off sharply and steadily. Same with Ireland, same with Belgium. These are some of the other top contenders here in the per capita cases graph. United States, not so much. It did rise, it did peak probably, but the slant downward is so slight that it certainly isn't mirroring the shape of, say, Spain. If it were the shape of Spain, the United States would already be down practically to zero. So it hit this peak, and that was nice. That was when I really first started reporting on this, is saying, look, the United States looks like it's about to hit a peak. What I hoped would happen, it would hit a peak, and then the downhill would look like the uphill. But it doesn't at all for the United States. But for many of these other countries, it really does. This is a pretty symmetrical hill we have here for Spain. Goes up, hits a peak, down at the same angle. Not the case for the United States. Why is that? I don't know. I'm not sure who does. But that's a very interesting question, why the United States has not recovered in the way that Spain has. Maybe it's just because Spain is this sort of single clump of people and culture, and United States is more like Europe in that it's got a whole bunch of such clumps. And so, for instance, Spain peaks here, but then Ireland peaks there, and Belgium peaks there, and maybe if we added all of them up, they'd look a little bit more like the United States. And what we're really seeing here is a New York peak here, and though it's then recovered a lot, then we had a California peak come on, Louisiana, and a Michigan peak, and some of these are continuing. I think Michigan may be peaking even now, maybe rising even now, and not really yet at its peak. And so that might explain that we're just sort of averaging a bunch of almost countries in the state of the United States, in the case of the United States. However, you also look at the United Kingdom, which isn't really like that, and it is doing the same thing the United States is, but even worse. It's peaked around the same time, and it's just steady, going a little up instead of a little down. You may see a few other trouble spots. Sweden, we always like to look at Sweden because Sweden is one of the countries, Brazil being another prominent one, but Sweden is one that very deliberately chose not to do a strong lockdown. And I'm not going to say this is a causal connection because whoever knows that, but I will say, take a data point here. Sweden didn't lock down. Sweden didn't peak. Now, Sweden eventually probably will peak. It will peak, but maybe it'll peak at 90% of the population infected or something, and that it'll be forced to peak then. But in terms of flattening the curve, Sweden, it's probably flattened the curve because it's done a lot of things to try to mitigate coronavirus, but it hasn't done the really extreme things they did in Spain, for instance, or where is Italy? Yeah, Italy, which led originally, also has settled down a lot. Switzerland, yeah, all these European countries peaked and have dropped, with possible exception of United Kingdom, if you'd like to call that a European country or a collection of countries or something. It is flat. Peru. So yeah, like Singapore, we keep hearing about as a potential new hotspot. I will say that Singapore seems to be going in a straight line here and actually maybe has a little bit of bend downward. So on the one hand, they're doing terribly per million. They have way more per million than anyone else has, or pretty much that anyone else has had. It's not just that they caught up with Spain because Spain declined. They've passed Spain's peak and they're still going strong. So Singapore is, I wonder if I can zoom this farther out. Probably not. This is as far as I've got. If I went even further back, I might see that Singapore at this point has a trend line higher than anyone has ever been in the world for coronavirus. So bad news for Singapore. And then there's Peru. We're seeing Peru and Mexico and I guess Ecuador to some degree. Some of the South and Central American countries are also seeing Brazil. We're keeping a close eye on Brazil as well, because like Sweden, it didn't do as much to lock down and didn't seem to take it very seriously. And so now we're watching, well, if it happens that everyone who locked down has a hill and everyone who didn't is a line, well, that starts to be a correlation, at least, and it's hard to ever say for sure when something causes another. One of the great challenges of science, but we can at least show a correlation there and say maybe it's because they didn't lock down as hard. Looking then at the rope chart by country. So this generally still looks good. This shows how, the growth rate day over day of each of the countries, of the top 25 in this case. And the zero line is around here. And I think most countries are below zero. It's not looking quite as good as it did a few days ago when we were really saying, yeah, this is obviously below zero, good downward trend for the world. The world's trend probably is still downward, but it's not quite as strongly downward as it was, I think, even just a few days ago. On the other hand, Singapore, I was noticing on this graph, you can see just the slightest bend. Those things which are so hard to see with just from this graph with your eye, to say whether Singapore is heading towards peaking. Well, first of all, this thing says it is very strongly. It has peaked days ago, and now the growth rate is heading downward. That means we're going to soon see this trend line flatten. In some sense, if these two graphs were aligned exactly, the trend line would already have flattened, and the other graph, the one below, the rope chart, is saying this was something like the peak, or maybe here. And if you look at the dots, you can imagine that really is a turning downward, but these trend lines are fairly conservative, and when they decide to turn downward. So Singapore still showing a peak, but probably not running off to infinity the way it looks like. All evidence suggests that, at least on a short-term basis, it is shrinking in new cases, and even more, it's heading downward. This rate of shrinkage is accelerating. Similarly, we have Ecuador. Ecuador was a real hot spot, well, a small hot spot. It had one of those shooting upwards lines that we sometimes see, and as is often the case, after it does that, then it suddenly shoots downward. They get a handle on the epidemic, they do whatever they need to do, and it heads downward. Or it was just sort of random that it shot upward because it had so few cases. But in the case of Ecuador, they're pretty high up our list here. They are probably not. Oh, now my graph has done the thing my graph sometimes does. Ecuador is probably not. It's not just the noise that had it do this, though it does look pretty noisy. I think we can imagine looking at this that there was an upward trend that peaked somewhere around here, and that there's now the beginning of a downward trend. Kind of hard to say. Let's zoom out a little bit and see if that's any clearer. No, it really doesn't jump out to me. But I will say Ecuador has had some exceptionally high growth days. They've had days where they almost doubled their number of cases from the previous days, and quite a few days where it's more than 50% growth. But those days are behind us. If you want to try to understand why the trend line is saying it's downward now, I might say, well, look at all the times it was above 50% growth. There are about 7 of them here, back in April 17th and earlier, and there's been nothing above 40 ever since. So that's a trend of sorts. It's sometimes hard to look at these and see what the math is seeing, but I do tend to believe the math that it says. This is, if we had to guess what the real growth rate every day has been, minus the noise, it would have been that thing that we just drew. I think I'm going to reload this because I like my rope chart too much to abandon it quite yet. And I will need to reload it to get my lines back. And it doesn't sometimes take very long to do that. Here we are already. So reloading the rope chart gives us this back. That's not the rope chart. There's the rope chart. And let's just take a quick look at which countries are problematic and not. So Ecuador, definitely the winner here. Portugal, France, Ireland, and Spain, all looking pretty good. Spain is flattened out a little bit, but as long as it stays below zero, which is way up here, Spain is fine. It doesn't have to trend downward. It's only if you're above zero that you really need to trend downward. We can't have positive growth rates forever. That would result eventually in an arbitrarily large number of cases. So the growth rates do have to eventually shrink, if only when the population is all infected. But in practice, we're seeing growth rates shrinking at much lower percentages of infection, we think. though. You look at the news, it's really hard to tell what the percentage of infections actually are. Sometimes it seems like it's just 2%. Sometimes some of the latest data, where was it from? Someone was saying they tested and 25% of their population was infected. It was somewhere significant, some big growth place. There was a small town study in the United States that did that, but I think this was almost a country. Maybe it was even Sweden. Someone was proposing that Sweden was actually 25% infected. Anyway, we'll get to know that later when the antibody tests come online, and then we may find out that a huge number of people have had it, haven't had much in the way of symptoms, but on the bright side, that would mean the mortality rate is a lot lower than we suspect it may be. So Portugal, France, Ireland, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Turkey, Italy, a lot of Europe, in other words, Ireland, Switzerland. These are all the good ones. Singapore, actually, for all that it's been a problem, as we see, is recovering. Singapore appears to have turned the corner 4 days ago, and though it actually is probably going to take the crown as the worst peak per capita of any country, at least so far, I hope forever, it looks like it is peaking and probably has peaked. And maybe when we really draw this thing, it's not going to be much higher than Spain. Its peak. So the countries that are doing worst are Peru, Pakistan, and Brazil. Always interesting to watch Brazil. And Mexico, which has been doing pretty poorly, still is, but at least it's trending downward. Chile, I don't remember Chile being maybe even on our list. I think it just arrived on our list a couple days ago. But as we see South America especially get hit by this, the hit seems to be happening later than it was Asia first, roughly speaking. Asia got it first, Europe got it second, North America got it third, South America got it fourth, and I think this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the fourth wave, or maybe it's fifth or something if you want to count India or Australia or various other places. Indonesia, I don't know. There are lots of places that have gotten it, but very roughly there was this travel from, it's almost like you start in Asia and you go westward, and when you hit the United States you go south, and now we have a series of epicenters in South America, and these are probably going to be the news for some days to come. They will peak, but they'll probably peak in the way that the others have, I'm guessing, just because we keep seeing it. The country gets it, they peak, and they usually peak somewhere around here, 50 to 100 maybe cases per million. But if we ever get a really bad one, we will, and if we have enough testing to know about it, we could theoretically have 1 million cases per million. Well, not per day, I guess. That'd be the total. But I'm not sure how high this could go in an epidemic that infects an entire country. But I wouldn't be super surprised to see maybe 1,000 people per million infected every day, or even 10,000. Doesn't take long at that rate to infect a country, but we'll see. So far, the numbers are fairly low. We're only talking here 150 per million each day, so it's not a large chunk of the population getting infected every day, but still it adds up. All right, and that's about it. We got a bunch of other, India, maybe worth noting, is not still running away with this. They seem to be recovering in spite of a lot of fear about it. Sweden, not doing too bad in terms of its growth rate. It had when we saw Sweden on this graph, it had a relatively large number of cases, but this is maybe more important. I prefer the rope chart because they actually tell us where things are turning. Is it recovering or not? They tell it before the number of cases do. So Sweden has a large number of cases, but it's not growing too fast per day. And then there's a cluster that are right around zero. Worldwide, the world is flat. Kind of like the United States. The world is just flat in new cases. And it's also flat in its growth rate, which you'd kind of expect. If the world really is flat, it's not growing or shrinking every day, same number of cases, roughly. We do have a troubling micro trend here of about 5 days. Doesn't mean too much, but you can see it could totally just be the same sort of noise we've been seeing. But interesting, and it's definitely this micro trend. If it had gone down instead of up, we would definitely see this curve turning down at this point. So it is this little trend upward that has the line thinking, maybe we're not getting better. And so the world, which has looked better than this, is looking mediocre right now. It's certainly not growing in epidemic, but it's not getting better either, and it's even getting very slightly worse, 1.5% each day. I'm going to swing by the deaths graphs as I usually do because they very much align with the cases graphs, and pop over to percent tested, top 25. As we've seen before, there are other smaller countries, most notably Iceland, that do terrifically well in testing. I'll look at that just briefly to see where they are. Yep, they just crossed 15%. Iceland has tested 15% of their population, and that's a lot. And because of the top 25, Portugal, the best, has only tested 4-point-something%. Portugal's really doing well. I didn't remember that Portugal was this outstanding leader in worldwide testing. But it is, according to this graph. Italy's still doing very well. Switzerland pretty well, maybe slowing down a little bit. Belgium is accelerating and has I don't quite believe that. It really seems like this is the trend line. I think any kindergartner would know that this is where you draw the line, not wherever the nonlinear regression thing decided to put it. But yeah, anyway, Belgium is looking good and is accelerating, and really so is Russia. Right? Both of these are doing well in picking up. You can see them very much curving upwards as they speed up their testing. Not just testing well, but testing faster and faster every day. 2.7% in Russia. And from what we hear, they may need it. Let's take a quick look at Russia. Russia per million. Russia it's pretty significant these days. And it's really got an angle up here that doesn't look very good. And especially three new days. 3 is enough for me to start saying something's a trend. But where is Russia on our... Oh, that's the deaths rate. Okay. I want to see Russia in cases. New cases. Okay. Maybe not quite so bad. I'm not quite sure why. There it goes. Obviously not good news for Russia. They're getting more and more cases every day. So they're... but what is the growth rate of their cases? Is it accelerating? And actually, the growth rate at Russia is looking pretty good. It looks like they're actually turning the corner now in growth, peaking at whatever this is, roughly, and hopefully then heading downward. But we'll see. We have a couple of pretty bad days in Russia and a couple of bad growth rates. It doesn't take many of those to bend this curve. But right now, if I had to guess, I'd say Russia has hit its peak and is heading in a better direction. And as we keep coming back to, when we see something like this, when we see that Russia is picking up its testing, is accelerating its testing, and we see that they're seeing more and more cases, well, that's a good example of correlation that may be causation. It may be that it's totally plausible that the reason Russia has more cases is because they're doing more testing that lets them detect more cases. So I have a feeling that the whole world is doing this right now, that even from a week ago, my sense was there wasn't enough testing capacity even to test the people who needed it most, who really needed it. And there was delays in testing of a week or sometimes more. There were cases, borderline cases especially, where people couldn't get tests. I think that all kind of started to change. It's been a gradual thing, but I think it's become very notable about a week ago, where the testing capacity is starting in many places, gradually, patchwork style, is starting to fill in the whole world with the ability to test not just the people who obviously need it, but a few more as well, and then even more, and then even more. And this thing that I saw in LA, though then I heard a contradiction to it, but I did get a reputable source a couple days ago that said LA is testing for free anybody who wants it, and that they have excess testing capacity. And if that's true, if it's not true, it will be true eventually. I don't guarantee it'll be for free, but I do guarantee you that eventually, in the next month, let's say, almost anyone in the world, anyone at least in the first world who wants to get tested, even without symptoms, will be able to. That's going to happen. And I think it's happening already, and I think that's why we're seeing some of these places rising. And that may be what's happening with Russia. I hope, because that would be good news. It would mean Russia doesn't actually have a runaway epidemic. They are just having a successful testing program. And I think when we see the whole world not looking as good as it did a week ago, I hope it's because of that. I'm not quite going to go so far as to make a prediction about that, but I think it's very plausible that testing is caught up, testing is still accelerating, testing is going to put a lid on it, and so the whole world will then peak and drop again in the next week, maybe next 2 weeks. But that only works. That only happens if we really do have if we really don't have actual infection spreading rampantly. If this really isn't effective testing alone. And that's just, I think no one knows that. We're getting more studies, we're getting more evidence that a lot of people have been infected already, and we're also just getting more and more testing that are letting us see who has been infected. And we're getting a lot more people to do contact tracing to help prevent people from being infected. But on the other hand, we're opening up all sorts of states in the United States and countries across the world, and that work counter to recovery. Make no mistake of it. Opening up the economy is a force against recovery of these curves. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means it's a decision that's not to flatten the curve as much, and to let more people get infected and to let more people die, because there are other important reasons that's worth doing. So, and also even in places it hasn't unlocked. I was driving in California a couple days ago. Legitimately, I do have an exception that lets me travel, but it was amazing how many people were on the road. It almost felt like the good old days. So there's also this sense of, I think, just weariness that people are, even in California, where by no means has it unlocked, people are just unlocking anyway. Or the beaches of Orange County and other things are getting hit by people who are just gradually getting tired of the lockdown and refusing to abide by it. And that may be okay. A lot of places are deliberately unlocking, and even if they non-deliberately unlock just through fatigue of the people, it may still be okay because we've bought ourselves this time to build up the hospital systems and build up testing and work towards the vaccine and all the other things that will probably put a lid on it, even if people stop being super diligent in following the lockdown orders. All right, that is a lot of talk. I'm going to move on to the states. So the news broadly for the countries of the world, not as good. I can't say broadly we're recovering today the way that I've been able to say it for some time now. We've according to these numbers, we're turning the corner back against recovery. I hope this doesn't start some new massive exponential slide. I'm hoping it's just because of the competing forces of those of the various things. More testing makes these numbers look worse. Less lockdown makes these numbers look worse. People not obeying the lockdown makes these numbers look worse. But on the other hand, the progression of the disease itself makes the numbers look better as we actually maybe hopefully are getting over it. So we'll see who wins. We have a tug of war here. We have a tug of war, and we have several brawny people on each end of this rope and brawny factors, and it is by no means clear whether we're gonna get pulled into recovery or out of it. So at the state level, this graph's boring as always. We just have New York winning everything, losing everything, and New Jersey. When you look at it, actually, let's just go straight per capita per day. We see something a little bit more like what we see in the countries, but not as good, where we see some hills. New York State has a great little hill going there. New Jersey has a pretty good one. There are a few other ones. Louisiana, Michigan, maybe. Not sure. Michigan looks like it may be turning in the wrong direction now. Having peaked, it may be unpeaking. And then there are some Massachusetts, Connecticut that are doing so-so, but haven't really peaked. And Illinois, which right now doesn't look to be doing well at all, they seem to have almost the latest day is worse than ever. So Illinois, Maryland, and then a bunch of other little ones. But let's go to the rope chart. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time here, since I spent so much on the countries. So there's our rope chart. I definitely can't look at this and say, yeah, it looks good, as I have in recent days. The states are definitely looking bad right now as a whole. Here's the zero line, and this has just changed in the 2 days since I did a podcast. It's swung substantially in the direction that we don't want, towards growth of new cases. Now again, could just be testing, hopefully, but the raw numbers here say the number of reported cases are growing. If it is testing, eventually this will turn back downward once we've caught up with the actual number of cases, but it's anyone's guess how long that will take. If this really is an epidemic, then the news is very bad here indeed, because almost all states, if this is really a growth of infection, the underlying infection rate, if this is correlated to the underlying infection rate, then almost all states are growing in their infection rates. And very few of them are below zero. The only ones that are actually doing affirmatively well are Tennessee, Texas, New York, Indiana, New Jersey and Indiana. Not even New York. There's New York. Even New York has turned back around and is heading upwards in its total number of cases. It's not quite above zero, so it's holding steady. But this is not what we need to see eventually for New York. It's done great, it's cut its cases, but here it is going back again upwards towards where it was in trouble. New York is in the top 5 or so. The really bad ones, Wisconsin, Michigan, Virginia, Washington, Illinois, North Carolina, Georgia. It'd be easy to point to Georgia and said, oh, look, you opened up and now you're looking bad. But first of all, it's too soon to have seen any effect in these graphs from opening up. There's at least 11-day period of incubation before the disease presents. I guess if they were doing really aggressive testing, like antibody testing, they might see it before with pre-symptomatic people. If they were testing very heavily in Georgia, but as far as I know, they're not testing very heavily in Georgia. But anyway, we can't really point a finger at Georgia here because a lot of states are doing the same. States that have had lockdowns, like I think Michigan. Yeah, Michigan is where there's all those protests about the lockdown, and still the governor insists on holding that lockdown. And looking at that graph, I think that's a good idea. I don't think this is the time where you look and say, well, we got 11% growth every day and accelerating upwards, 11% new cases every day. Let's all go back to work. I don't know, maybe it's just testing, but there are probably multiple factors that go into this, and my guess is one of them might actually be the underlying infection rate for Michigan. It's certainly shown some signs of trouble. But we don't know. We're just going to have to keep watching. But right now, broadly, the states are looking bad. They're trending upwards. Now, we were talking about testing. How is Michigan doing in testing? Not very well. Michigan is definitely in the lower pack. The ones that are doing well are Rhode Island still, home of CVS, New York, Massachusetts, Louisiana, New Jersey, Connecticut, and others. So the worst one is it? No, Virginia is not worst anymore. Go Virginia. Arizona is now the worst, and even Arizona is above 1%. So everyone's tested more than 1% of their population. All 25 of the largest states have tested more than 1% of their population, and that should be enough to get them over the epidemic. My guess is it worked for South Korea. If you just test steadily 1% at a rate that gets you to 1%, I think you win. You win against the epidemic. You do not end up seeing seeing everyone infected. New York is doing great. They're testing more per capita even it's not just that they're big, so they have a lot of testing capacity. Their numbers are way ahead of everyone per capita. They're testing 0.3% of their population every day, sometimes more. So in other words, every 3 days they test 1% of their population. Oh, I am talking about New York because I saw it there somewhere, but it's not New York. This is Rhode Island. And maybe it is because they're small, but really it's because they have CVS. So what I said about New York, never mind. I get confused because they're both blue here, but Rhode Island is the winner in per capita testing. They're testing 0.3%. So every single day they test, every 3 days they test 1% of their population. And that's why they have more than 6% tested. They've been doing this for days and days, weeks and weeks now, and so they're way up ahead of everyone and not accelerating necessarily. Well, they actually are accelerating. The slope is upward, so they are even accelerating beyond what they've done. Massachusetts doing very well, and there's New York, not as well. They do okay. They're testing 0.1% every day, so it takes them 10 days to test 1% instead of just 3 or maybe 8 days in this case. What's their very latest number? No, that's Louisiana. Yeah, maybe 8 days. Every 8 days they test 1% of their population. So that's not anything like what Louisiana's doing. But so far, New York's done okay. They seem to be, I don't think they have an excess testing capacity yet. They're trying, but yeah, New York, they're doing well. It's at least they're not California. Where's California? California had that one crazy day. So remember, Rhode Island was somewhere up 0.3%. California is at 0.07%. So quarter of the speed of Rhode Island, if I got my numbers right. Yeah, that's about right. It's not miserable. California is also accelerating. Their rate of testing is growing. So, okay, you go California. You're not competing with the big boys like Rhode Island, but you're in the running at least. If we see where California fits in the total daily testing, let's see if we can blink it. It's hard because it keeps changing the scale when I blink it. Where's California? All right, I'm not going to try too hard to figure that one out. But it's certainly not one of these top 5. It's not even down there. It's somewhere in this pack. California doing better, but a whole lot of other states are doing even better. And given my interest in California, I always find that particularly upsetting. Why can't California, one of the tech hubs of the country and the world, why can't it do this, including medical technology? Why can't it do this? Why can't it match Rhode Island? So we'll keep an eye on that. Los Angeles still doing this wild, relatively wild, given this type of graph wave here. Yeah, who can say from this graph? Let's look at per capita new cases by county. We're now in the counties, by the way. I just sort of transitioned without saying so. Imperial, still the per capita winner. Beating out Los Angeles. So Imperial really still has a problem. They crept onto the bottom of this list a week ago, maybe. I said, oh, Imperial, hello. Do you have a problem? And the answer is yes. Now there are seven higher in the list, moving into the top 20. Imperial has a problem. We'll see how much of a problem. It's certainly enough just to know that you have more cases per capita every day than any other county. In fact, pretty much twice as many as any other county, Los Angeles being the exception there. But it also appears to be growing, and we'll see whether the growth rate is accelerating. Riverside is at least showing a bit of a downward trend finally. San Francisco also seems to have peaked and is dropping. We'll look at which of these are hills. Obviously, Imperial is not a hill. It just shoots off to infinity off our scale entirely. Los Angeles looked like a hill and then kind of lost it. San Francisco is peaked and is falling, shows no signs of losing that one. Santa Barbara peaked and is falling. San Mateo also is doing a Los Angeles. It peaked and then lost it, and now it's rising again. Sacramento looks pretty good. Yeah, so it's a mix. It's a mix. But let's look at the rope chart. That's the one that really tells us where we're going. As I recall, yeah, I've looked at this rope chart. This rope chart looks a lot like the states right now, which is to say not so good. Not terrible. Well, actually, this is pretty terrible. Terrible would be if everyone were above zero, 20% above zero and rising, but we do have some of those. We have Tulare right in the middle in number of cases. So this is no small population. I don't know what the population of Tulare is, but at least in growth, in total cases, they are competing in the minors, at least here, and they are rising. They're growing faster than anyone. They're almost up to 20% growth and rising. So Tulare really has a problem. They have everything we hate to see. Imperial population is below 200,000. Yeah, something to keep in mind. Yeah, so Imperial, as always, it's one of the, well, it's kind of like talking about Tulare. I haven't looked at the population. If you want to look that up too, Isaac, you can let me know. But it's one thing to say Tulare is tiny, like Santa Cruz, we say. Santa Cruz County is tiny in Monterey, and so the effects that they have are mild. But when they start rising into the middle of this list, I start to say, okay, it's small, but we're not. This isn't a per capita list. This is the total cases list, and so that suggests something almost more strongly. If they're a small county, that they've risen into they're ahead of San Joaquin, and I don't know. It's still mostly small counties here. They're not certainly competing with Los Angeles and San Francisco quite, but they're knocking on the door of Sacramento and San Mateo and some pretty big counties in terms of total cases. So, yeah, Imperial is less so, but it suggests to me that there are a very high percentage of people in Tulare and Imperial who are infected at this point, and that's a problem. So growth rates, and also I do try to, Tulare 466, that is a substantial county. I do try to, by using this particular one, I'm trying to compare each county with itself, not with each other so much in terms of the growth rate trend. So rather than, for instance, this is the one that really compares them without any sense of population adjustment, where it's just Los Angeles and nothing else. And this one does adjust by population. So here, if we see Tulare, it's in the upper part as adjusted by population. Let's take a little bit bigger view here. So is that Tulare? Yeah, so there's Tulare. It's certainly above the bottom in its per capita cases, but it's still a half or a third of the really extreme ones. And of the Imperial, again, as Isaac is pointing out, because it has such a small population, I always come back to saying, well, it just could be sort of random factors. It could be they have a pocket of, one nursing home gets it, and suddenly Imperial has 100% growth rate. So we see that. On the other hand, we've seen Imperial grow and grow and grow, and unlike Ohio, where they got one prison that burst them to the top and then suddenly it went away, is that happening for Imperial? Well, maybe. The very latest numbers here, for Imperial at least, are lower. That's not Imperial, but this number for Imperial, that number from Imperial. And so maybe they had a burst and they're recovering. If so, this will all just go away and they'll disappear from our top of this list. But for now, where's Imperial in the rope chart? I think Imperial is shrinking in the rope chart. Yeah. So we see those two points we just saw are starting to pull the rope chart down. Imperial, which was per capita the highest in the state, now trending downward, and probably it's eventually going to be a hill like everyone else. But I think its per capita hill is going to be higher, just like, what was it? can't remember what one we were looking at earlier, where I was saying, well, yeah, okay, this one it's going to get over it, but its peak is actually higher per capita than anyone else, and that's saying something. But then Tulare, which is substantial, is really in bad shape right now, as it does continue to grow very strongly, and it's relatively big, which isn't reflected in this graph, but it is. What is? Okay, I see. I'm going to take a quick look myself, just so I can answer my own question, which is, what is my own question? The size of Tulare versus, I don't care. I'm gonna move on. I'm not gonna get distracted there. But also San Bernardino, looking bad. Also looking big. These are not good graphs we have here. 15% day-over-day growth and accelerating in one of our biggest contributors, our number 5 county. Contra Costa, maybe our roughly number 10, also 15% and accelerating. Similarly with San Mateo and Orange. So the news is not good here. The best spin that I can put on it is we can hope that this is just because of better testing. Testing keeps getting better. We can hope that this is all just because of better testing. I'm guessing it's a mix. I'm guessing we actually really are seeing epidemics in Tulare and San Bernardino, because that's just a lot of growth. But we'll see. We'll see. Overall, the shape of this is pretty V-shaped. Not what we like to see. We had such a nice time of it back in April when it looked like all the counties were recovering. It's no longer obvious that's the case. It could be that we're just testing and finding out more cases when no new growth of cases is actually happening. But there's just no way to say that from this data. The data overall is pointing to a kind of bad future here, and we'll keep watching this closely to see which way it goes. San Joaquin and Yolo both doing great. Yolo, however, has just, well, actually, it was Yolo. I think Yolo was maybe number 2 yesterday. They suddenly jumped into the list, and they're not, I don't believe, a big county, but they are shrinking even more now in cases. Los Angeles, great. This is the only thing that keeps the state's numbers looking remotely good, given all that, is that Los Angeles, which has the most cases, is shrinking at a nice rate of 8% per day. And then we have a few others that are also doing fairly well. Okay. Ventura's headed upwards, but Imperial, Alameda, we've talked about some of those headed downwards. All right, so that's the news for the day. I guess we can look quickly at testing. San Francisco is still testing like gangbusters. 2% is a very good percent to have tested in the region. Riverside also. We've obviously seen a lot more. We've seen 15%, we've seen 8% in various places, but still. So there's something to shoot for there, but 2% is very good. San Luis Obispo is in the dumpers here with 0.4%, but oh well. Hopefully everyone is accelerating. I don't have a graph. I really keep wishing I had a graph of what's the per day tests, because these are always just going to look like they're going upwards because every day we test more people. I really want to know, is the rate at which we're testing rising? I'll see if I can get that into tomorrow's report. So the news is mixed. Worldwide, we're kind of flat, not obviously recovering. Statewide, the trend is definitely bad. Statewide as well. California-wide, the trend is bad a little bit. This isn't terrible, but there's no way to put a good spin on this one. Or the states also rising in new cases. The only good spin that I can say, which I think is a very legitimate spin to put on it, is maybe it's just because we're testing so much better. If so, we'll see this turn downward in the next few days, or at least weeks. So we'll keep an eye on that. I'm going to bring some more of that testing information online so I can actually say, yeah, see, we're testing better. But we do see that, at least at the state level, we do have, this is daily. The state level, we have testing. We have the daily testing, and it's rising. This is not just just that we're testing the same number of people every day. We're testing more and more people every day. So I'm guessing this also is happening at the county and the hopefully the country level. And so as we continue to test more and more people, we will find more and more cases until we reach some balance point where we've kind of found them all. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.